Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Makdisi Street. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Aslı Bâli, who is the Howard Holtzman Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Asla's teaching and research interests have included public international law, especially a focus on human rights law and the law of international security order, and comparative constitutional law with a focus, of course, on the Middle East. Prior to joining Yale's law school, Aslı was a professor of law at UCLA's School of Law, where she served as a founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and was also the director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. Aslı is also, in addition to being an extraordinary scholar and public speaker, Aslı is the president of the Middle East Studies Association, which is the largest scholarly association dealing with the Middle East. And so, Aslı, it's a great honor for us to have you here with us today on Makdisi Street. So, Aslı, welcome to Makdisi Street. We're really delighted to have you. And I guess the first question we would ask you is, given where you are at Yale and where you've been at UCLA, and your authority as an expert in international law, and also as president of MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, what is your sense of where we are today in terms of academic freedom and the general academic climate in the U.S. today?
Thanks so much for this, Osama. And by the way, it's a special pleasure to be joining Makdisi Street while you are president-elect of MESA. I just want to acknowledge that we are working as a team at the association, and I'm so delighted to have the chance to work with you. To think about the lay of the land in the U.S., I think it's important to actually start with Gaza. I became president of MESA in October 2023. And at the time that I became president, words like scholasticide and educide were not in my vocabulary. I didn't know these concepts. And then what I witnessed at MESA, and I think the number one impact on the field, is the astonishing degree to which this is our daily vernacular now, because the impact of the war on the possibility of academic work on Palestine, and in fact, academic work in Gaza, as well as about Gaza, and on the right to education more generally, is basically incalculable. I mean, the human toll in Gaza itself has to be the starting point. The destruction, which we've written about at MESA, of the entire territory, its archaeological, religious, and cultural heritage, the basic grounds that one would use to study the history of Palestinians. The level of trauma, the destruction of historical and archaeological sites dating back 4,000 years, world's oldest mosques and churches, archives, museums, libraries, every university and every institution of higher education, and the killing of faculty, chairs, deans. And when we say something like 45,000 in the incredible undercount that we have at present, 46,000 from the Ministry of Health, we have to keep in mind that we're talking about a territory that is 1/3 children, which means a minimum of 15,000 students who have been killed just amongst children, not including university students. So that's the starting point. The opening thing to say about where are we is that we are sitting in a country that has facilitated and in many cases directly contributed to the destruction of the possibility of higher education in a territory that in Middle East studies is at the heart of our enterprise. Whether you're a historian or an archaeologist or a sociologist or an anthropologist, the possibility of work on or in Gaza has been radically imperiled. But obviously, when we turn our attention to the United States and the challenge of balancing these two things, keeping in mind that we're talking about genocidal circumstances and their impact, while at the same time thinking about the consequences of all of this and the repression that we've seen in the United States for the more prosaic questions of academic freedom and university life and higher education in North America, it's hard to know how to strike that balance. But we've seen an enormous range of harms just in terms of that prosaic side of the ledger as well. I mean, to begin with, obviously, this has been a time of outright racial profiling and serious injury to students that includes the things that were covered nationally, like the shooting of 3 Palestinian students in Vermont, the person hit by a car at Stanford's campus, the harassment and discrimination targeting anybody that is seen as critical of Israel or identified as Palestinian or Muslim or Arab in this climate. But we've also seen basically just a slew of new policies across universities. That mention that I gave of the racial profiling, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg of what's happened on the front of anti-Palestinian racism on campuses. But beyond that, in terms of violations of academic freedom across the board, selective enforcement of rules, prior restraint on events, the disciplining of students and faculty who advocate for or just engage in basic expressive conduct about Palestinian rights, the banning of student organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, SJP, other advocacy organizations, the application of bespoke rules on a completely arbitrary basis, almost always with no notice, impacting just events that concern not just Palestine, by the way, but broadly Middle East studies now. The phrase Middle East itself becoming a search term for censoring syllabi and curricula. Universities that prohibit actual words. I mean, this is in the United States and in its tradition of libertarianism that we have seen campuses suggest that the word intifada, for example, might be somehow verboten. We have at Mesa received countless instances of reports of university and college leadership infringing on academic freedom through the scrutinizing of syllabi and curricula for content critical of Israel. And of course, we've had incredible numbers of faculty and students facing disciplinary proceedings that have resulted in everything from suspension to termination. And on top of all of this, the congressional inquisitions that we witnessed in the spring, beginning in the winter of 2023 and on into the spring, with interrogations of university professors presidents, that has produced a shift across the country from something like, let's just say, meek defense of some basic principles of freedom of expression, academic freedom, ordinarily from university leadership. And that because they are required to do so constitutionally in the case of public universities, and because most private universities have claimed to abide by the First Amendment, to post-Inquisition, a complete retreat, with university leadership agreeing outright and openly to censor and abrogate the academic freedom of students and faculty in response to campaigns of intimidation, whether from government or from private donors or from alums. So when you take all of this together, the chilling effect on campuses is astonishing. It is very widespread. And incidentally, it's not just limited to student and faculty speech, but also is producing harms that are disproportionately impacting communities of color more broadly and in their protest activities, even beyond campuses, where individuals are subjected to violence, harassment, and defamation, rendering them vulnerable to discrimination by employers, and producing an atmosphere of fear and suspicion on campuses and beyond campuses relating to any kind of protest. So all of this has been the landscape that I've been confronted with. And the backdrop to much of this has been fears of alleged increases in campus anti-Semitism becoming the pretext for speech repression. So what we've seen across the country is a reframing of dissent as a form of discrimination, which has its own sets of corollary follow-ons, both on campuses and beyond campuses. Now, of course, there have been instances of anti-Semitism, undoubtedly, as there have been of anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism, and other forms of discrimination on campuses and beyond. But the seriousness of these incidents is precisely the reason not to conflate actual discrimination with dissenting speech and the kinds of things we see being repressed. The blurring of the lines between, protected speech and discrimination is not just dangerous in the Israel-Palestine context, although it is extremely dangerous in the Israel-Palestine context, but it also feeds into a broader right-wing campaign to repurpose anti-discrimination law into a broader cudgel, including to preclude historical study of the United States itself, on the grounds that studying the history of racial discrimination and racial injustice in the United States constitutes an intimidating climate for white students or for white communities more generally. So I could go on any of these fronts.
Well, Asla, actually, yeah, that's already kind of devastating enough. Almost, we could almost stop here. But what do you think is driving this? Like, who's in the driving seat here, or are there different driving seats? Like, for example, at my own university, which has been sort of, I think, I don't know. I guess there are different universities that compete to being the textbook case of repression of students and faculty, but mine is certainly one of them. Like what makes these kinds of things happen? Why is it that our university presidents or chancellors or whatever become so, I don't know, toothless, spineless, mouthless, wordless when it comes to this kind of thing? What drives it? And then also who's driving it too? Can we say, is it specific? Is it the lobby? Is it donors? Are those the same thing? Like what do you think is behind this in the US specifically?
Well, Asla, sorry to interrupt you, Asla. Sorry to add on to that Sadi's question, since then we can wrap this section on the academic stuff. Just very briefly, is there, like, in what you said earlier, is there a pattern that southern states are worse than northern, like Republican states worse than Democratic states in general terms, in terms of looking at syllabi, as you said? I mean, these are really quite draconian measures. And is it more public institutions or private institutions? Could you just give us, as you answer Seti's questions, could you just give us a sense of how this works out in terms of the aggregate?
Yeah, let me just start with what's driving this. So the repressive climate I've just been describing has been driven by, in my view, right-wing strategists that have seized upon opportunistically the Gaza war and protest as an opportunity to add momentum to pre-existing initiatives that were basically oriented to anti-DEI. Of course, the current administration in the United States, the Trump administration, has brought to a crescendo all of these efforts. But well before October 7th, dozens of states with Republican-dominated legislatures, and to your point, Osama, many of them in the South, states like Florida under Governor Ron DeSantis, Texas under Governor Greg Abbott, had already proposed laws or executive orders banning the teaching of critical race theory, and even books and curricula on diversity had defined ideas like divisive concepts as part of a conservative playbook. That phrase, I believe, was introduced by Governor Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, so not necessarily so far deep to the South. And properly understood, the current efforts to repress speech on campuses are an extension of this strategy and the broader campaign against basically efforts to address structural racism in the United States, which itself had begun to grow out of the moment of the racial justice uprising in 2020. So that uprising and the sort of embrace of the idea that it was the time to address structural racism in the United States in a very limited set of quarters, that idea was embraced. But that was enough to produce a massive backlash politics driven by right-wing strategists who began in the places where they had the tightest stronghold. So again, as you say, states in the South where they had dominated legislatures and had willing governors, but it expanded dramatically from there. Discussion, study, and teaching about Israel-Palestine joined the pantheon of so-called divisive concepts after October 7th, allowing the weaponization of worries about anti-Semitism to advance a project of suppressing viewpoints that are disfavored by groups outside of the university, and as another mechanism for fighting back against diversity efforts, because now there was an opportunity to take the language of anti-discrimination and repurpose it as part of the right-wing strategy that previously had been targeting efforts to engage in anti-discriminatory conduct on campuses. The incentive structures that the current climate creates for universities explain the retreat of university presidents, in my view. It's often going to be in their interest to avoid both donor pressure as well as government pressure, particularly now that you have a trifecta in government of a Republican president and both houses of Congress dominated by Republicans as well, to avoid pressure to take aggressive steps to repress pro-Palestinian advocacy on campus. And we've seen, of course, plenty of evidence of this even before the results of the November 2024 election on the character of the federal government. Meanwhile, the pedagogical obligations of the university, including teaching by example, that it's worthwhile to pay a cost to protect the heart of the enterprise of scholarship and teaching from efforts at politicized intervention and censorious pressure, have been absolutely abandoned. None of those pedagogical obligations, educating for a democratic society, reaffirming and advocating core commitments to academic freedom, even expressing commitments to racial justice, all of these things have fallen by the wayside. And actually the contrast, in some sense, for those of us who study the Middle East, to the Middle East is itself interesting. In the Middle East, you've had countless examples of an authoritarian turn in which academics and universities have stood up and engaged in resistance, have actually tried to be at the forefront of efforts to denounce authoritarianism, to defend these very same values. And yet here in the United States, a country that prides itself on its democratic commitments and its institutional longstanding norms of freedom of speech, of libertarian commitments, of the autonomy of higher education, you see just a complete retreat, a laying down of arms in a way that I find stunning. If you'll allow me, if you'll indulge me one example, I happened to be invited to give a talk at Columbia University. I was invited a year before the talk. It was long planned. It was a keynote at the Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. And it so happened that the day that I was at Columbia University give that talk, which again had been scheduled a year in advance, Manoush Shafiq, the then president of Columbia University, was testifying to Congress. And as a consequence of that, the campus was locked down in a way that in, for example, Turkey, where you had government intervention at Bosphorus University to lock the gates of the campus, the idea of the gates of a university being locked became a focal point for mass mobilization against this kind of resistance, not just on campus and not just by faculty, but across Turkey, across Istanbul. You had protests of the idea of locking down of a university. At Columbia, you had complete silence that day. When I arrived, I had to get a police escort to even come onto the campus to give the talk. And essentially, you had faculty waiting to see what might happen, but not taking up arms. Later, of course, Columbia University became the site of very substantial protests, but they were driven by students. The question I have is, where is university leadership? Where are those in high administration and faculty that amongst their analogs in Turkey put on black robes, turned their back to the university administration building, and conducted day after day after day of protest, of repression on their campuses? We see nothing comparable to that. And I don't mean to single out Columbia University here, because we see it at no campus anywhere in the country. You have small pockets of faculty joining hands with students, but you have no broad-based movement in defense of the basic vocation of the university and of higher education. And of course, now we could pull away from campus and look more broadly at the country and ask, in the face of governmental support for what is a very well-documented genocidal project, which is being litigated in the highest courts in the international system, which has been affirmed at the International Court of Justice as a plausible case of genocide, has resulted in arrest warrants out of the International Criminal Court, you would expect to see far more anti-war, anti-genocide mobilization on the streets of the United States. And honestly, it's troubling to see the quietude, particularly now, particularly after the election of Donald Trump, with which this legacy of conduct in Palestine has been met.
Asla, actually, one of the most amazing things, I mean, you've touched on university presidents and leaderships, and we understand that it doesn't excuse them by any means, but they are under specific pressures and donors and regents and whatever, which doesn't, I mean, I still think they could take a stand or they could resign in protest or something like that, but they don't seem to have the courage to do that kind of thing. But ordinary faculty, I mean, yeah, at every university, for example, groups of faculty for justice in Palestine are helping students, and and there are knots of faculty at everywhere, Columbia, NYU, UCLA, Berkeley, wherever. But the amazing thing to me is to see most other faculty, like our colleagues who are not immediately concerned. Some are intervening to help, especially at UCLA when we had riot police on our campus. Some faculty, beyond the kind of the normal kind of people who would be engaged on the question of Palestine, for example, some faculty stepped up, but most of our colleagues seem to put their heads in the sand, and they seem to think that this will somehow not affect them. And we know, I'm sure you know better than I do, the extent to which, as you said, what we're seeing now is a kind of unholy alliance between Zionist propaganda outfits like the ADL, for example, and a long-standing right-wing drive to repress and crush liberal universities, going back to probably the Trilateral Commission, decades ago already, right? So what we're seeing is it's not in other words, this is affecting not just the expression around Palestine, but a whole set of academic freedoms more generally. And so to me, it's disturbing to see our let's say our liberal colleagues put their heads in the sand and hope this is going to go away somehow. It's not going to come to affect them. But they don't seem to realize this will affect them in the end. Once they've crushed, if they're able to, studying the question of Palestine, then whatever is next on the agenda, right? And the principle of academic freedom is a principle. Once the principle is broached or done or broken, then everybody connected to it goes down, basically, right? And there just doesn't seem to be this wider realization among some of our colleagues not immediately connected to Palestine that this also affects them, that their own academic life is at stake here. I don't know. Do you have a way to? Maybe there's no way to explain it.
I mean, again, it's interesting. I think it's the mirror image of the sort of given status of democratic commitments in the United States, that people are sanguine about the durability of those institutions and those norms. And they imagine that any one of these things is going to be somehow constrained to a small pocket and is not going to endanger the overall enterprise. And it's, of course, a category mistake. It's a fundamental fallacy. When you look at the kind of wide-ranging set of risks that are now materializing through the Trump administration, they, of course, have absolutely nothing to do with Palestine. Palestine was a wedge issue that enabled this existing culture war to be turbocharged. But now that it has been turbocharged, we're talking about scrutiny of accreditation agencies and undermining or politicizing their activities in order to bring universities to heel. We're talking about the possibility of imposing onerous burdens on endowments and lifting tax exemptions for universities, which, of course, returning to Osama's earlier question, is going to affect private universities even more fundamentally than public universities, although public universities face more direct forms of censure from their state governments, again, particularly in states that are Republican dominated. We see already federal funding essentially being frozen across a whole range of areas. We see the possibility of elimination of the Department of Education altogether. So that will have its own implications for sources of federal funding, for not just research, but also for students' capacity to afford higher education in the United States. All of this is part of not just a culture war, but I would argue a cultural revolution of trying to remake the nature of higher education altogether in a political direction. And it's also a deepening of the neoliberalization of universities. We've already seen the wages of that, right? The amount of private actors that are able to bring a university to heel is a phenomenon that just doesn't exist as an analog, for example, in many other societies where you see an assault on higher education, but it comes exclusively from public actors. Here, private actors work hand in glove with public actors, and they have special purchase over private universities. That's a consequence of the neoliberal turn. But now it has come to an extreme point where the viability of any work in the humanities and social sciences, not just curricula and syllabi on the Middle East, but really anything that purports to train critical thinking, is not only in danger, but seen as superfluous. Where's the need for critical thinking? What we need on this telling of this cultural revolution is doctors, engineers who are going to be able to drive the AI revolution further forward, maybe business schools, maybe law schools, and what else? It's not clear that there's anything else. Basic science research, medical schools, engineering. These are the values that have a return on investment at the neoliberal university. And those that have this understanding of higher education, together with those who are cultural warriors who want to use their assault on the university to remake a culture in the image of a historical America that they imagine can be restored, are together in this campaign driving an assault that, of course, would affect all of our colleagues. Now, some of them, they have not organized on Palestine. Okay, we can agree on that. There are small pockets, as we've said. Some of them grew somewhat when they saw the scale of repression and outright violence that was being visited on students on their campuses. But the place that we see organizing is the expansion of AAUPs across the country in this semester, and the idea that faculty and staff have to organize around questions of governance at their own universities. They need to come to understand what are the rules. For example, few people are familiar with the handbooks on their own campuses. What are their actual rights? How does the university articulate a commitment to academic freedom? What does that mean in practical terms for their ability to engage in extramural speech, for their ability to organize around questions of governance, for their ability to resist deplatforming and rethink the terms on which knowledge production is occurring on their campuses to the extent to which they can own their own work? I mean, these are really fundamental questions that astonishingly, at most universities, most faculty haven't found occasion to ask previously. And in most countries, that's just not true. First of all, faculty are organized as labor. They understand themselves to be in a relationship to the management of their universities that is at times conflictual and requires bargaining and negotiation. Outside of public universities, for the most part, that just hasn't been the tradition in the United States. So there are many, many reasons that might explain why you haven't had a tradition of organized faculty politics in the United States, but it is long overdue. The moment has come. And, I can only speak for my own campus, but certainly efforts to get an AAUP chapter off the ground and to really think carefully about what university governance looks like are present to a degree now that could not, that outstrips by far what was available just a year ago on this campus. Sorry, I was just going to say one thing, if of interest, which is some of the work that Mesa has been undertaking in the area of academic freedom. I just wanted to note quickly that we successfully received a Mellon grant, and we are undertaking a major initiative. And one of the things that we really want to focus on is getting a better understanding of the landscape in the country from the perspective of just data collection, because one of the biggest challenges we have is there's a very organized infrastructure for the collection of data on, for example, claims of anti-Semitism on campuses, real in some instances, and in other instances, reporting of things like students feeling uncomfortable because they hear Arabic being spoken on campus, or feel uncomfortable with the mention of Palestine and so forth. So these things are all conflated into one giant data set that purports a massive upsurge of anti-Semitism on campuses. We don't have good data on what else has been happening on campuses, and specifically the forms of discrimination and repression that pro-Palestinian voices have faced. And this is in part because communities are afraid to report their experiences, because reporting an instance of being targeted with repression can easily be turned into itself evidence that you were engaging in either conduct that was critical of Israel or pro-Palestinian speech, and might itself invite investigation of the target of repressive action. So for many, many reasons, we have very poor data, and it's incredibly important to get a more accurate picture of the scale of the assault on academic freedom across the country. And so we're beginning that kind of a data collection process. And we're also trying to identify, active partners in this moment that are, engaged in a battle to preserve the autonomy of higher education and the autonomy of universities and protect academic freedom. And so I think that's one of the things, because of the phrase Middle East, as I've already said, being at the very intersection of many of these different right-wing initiatives. So the phrase Middle East, as I said, is often the search term that is used in order to determine which syllabi and which curricula need to be scrutinized in our new censorious climate. As a consequence of that, if you're called the Middle East Studies Association, if you're a scholarly association of academics who are studying the Middle East, you are truly in the crosshairs at this moment. And what that means from our perspective is that it's an opportunity for us to seize the momentum, to identify what's happening and what's coming down the pike. So for the rest of our colleagues who may think that because they don't work on the Middle East or they don't work on Palestine, they're going to be spared, they're mistaken for the reasons we've all just discussed, but they may not be mobilized. It's on us at this moment to think about what that mobilization needs to look like and really lead the way. If Palestine, if Middle East is going to be turned into the wedge for this culture war, then it is incumbent upon the scholarly association that speaks for this field to do so in a forthright manner, even as university leadership retreats from the defense of those same values.
Asla, you've painted this rather grim picture on college campuses and in the U.S. in terms of the human rights as well, and the kind of crackdowns. I want to push this a little bit in terms of, you've written a lot about international human rights law, and you wrote this interesting piece, I think about a year ago, talking about or trying to push an idea of what you call the restraint plus approach to U.S. foreign policy as a way to, as you say, to achieve for the far greater bang for the American buck in terms of human rights than the costly and flawed coercive toolkit which the U.S. continues to depend. So this idea of a restraint plus approach, I'm wondering, I think you wrote this maybe just as the Gaza genocide was starting around that time. So obviously much has happened, but where do you see U.S. foreign policy in terms of pushing a human rights agenda or creating the opposite of a human rights agenda? And I'm not sure, and of course now Trump has been elected. I'm not sure that Trump is making it worse as opposed to what the Biden was, at least in terms of the Middle East. And maybe, I don't know about other parts, but certainly in terms of the Middle East, in terms of enabling, not just enabling genocide, but going after the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and trying to take down the central tenets of the international legal system. So where are we here? Is there still an international human rights thing, or are those just pockets of resistance of a previous era? And so we're still clinging on to a discourse, we're clinging on to activism as opposed to actual doctrine in human rights. And where U.S. policy kind of goes with this?
Yeah. So there are a lot of questions embedded in that. We'll start with U.S. foreign policy and then step back to the question of international legal order more generally. So that piece was written well in advance. It was written, I think, maybe in May or June of 2023. And basically, the argument that I was making in that piece is that the best way the United States can advance human rights is by desisting from the kinds of coercion it engages in through American foreign policy. I was addressing there both use of military intervention, military assistance to repressive allies, military assistance to allies committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and more generally, a kind of interventionist foreign policy that exacts massive coercive toll, oftentimes dressed up in the language of human rights. And so the claim I was advancing in that piece was that the US could do more by doing much, much less. If one really cares about human rights, it would be far better for the United States to, for example, withdraw from most of its activities in the Middle East. That would advance human rights in the Middle East more surely than almost any active thing that the Biden administration was likely to do. Now, are there ways that a US administration could actively advance human rights? Yes. Have I in my lifetime seen a US administration who, for political purposes, would be interested in that project? No. I have never seen one in my own lifetime. I think the likelihood of an imperial hegemonic actor using its power in the world to advance the rights of civilian populations abroad is very low under any circumstances and has never been on the menu geopolitically in the context of the United States. So that was the context for that piece. But the broader question you ask about international legal order, I think, needs to be disaggregated. So an earlier time when the United States did advance the interests, I think, of communities worldwide in some way was at the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when the United States was the architect of some of the international institutions that we have today, the UN Security Order, the creation of an international court, et cetera. Why would the US have done this? It was a form of enlightened self-restraint at that time, which was a consequence of two devastating world wars and the advent of nuclear weapons. So for the generation thinking about how to structure American hegemony in the wake of the Second World War, as the United States emerged as, clearly primus inter pares amongst all parties in the international system, how to have an international order that was not going to result within the next foreseeable half century in planetary extinction through the use of nuclear weapons. That was the challenge. There was a way that the mind is clarified in the wake of two massive world wars, and particularly the experience of the First World War, which was understood as the Great War, the war to end all wars, being so soon succeeded by a Second World War within 2 decades, in part because of the architecture at the end of the First World War that was put in place for international order through Versailles, through the League of Nations, which failed, which didn't hold. So there was an attempt to internalize those lessons of the interwar period and establish a structure that would make it possible to have stable international order over which the United States would preside as a hegemonic actor, containing any threat from the Soviet Union. And there were no other comers at that time that could potentially challenge the United States. That order did indeed put in place institutions that were helpful broadly for many communities beyond the United States. It made, the reconstruction of Europe possible. It set in motion some of the dynamics that allowed for an, let's say, reasonably orderly process of decolonization. Decolonization was obviously driven by both collapsing European empires and the agency of national liberation movements. But the fact of having a forum like the United Nations facilitated the possibility of imagining sovereignty for the rest of the world, the 2/3 of the world that had been under imperial domination until the middle of the 20th century. And that at that moment, too, this idea of human rights was introduced. And with it came a kind of potent possibility, not realization, not for decades after 1948 did you have any binding international human rights law. And actually the first instance of binding international human rights law is not, as is often imagined, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. It was the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, was the first binding multilateral treaty in the human rights realm. And that too was an example of a master class in diplomacy by the global South, bringing to heel the imperial powers that had long dominated them and criminalizing their conduct by establishing a norm that prohibits racial discrimination and policies based on racial discrimination. So the
Can you,
international
Asli,
rights
can you just for our listeners and viewers, can you just elaborate when that was, just so that people know what you're talking
the
about?
Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was negotiated in the 1960s and I believe came into force in 1969, but don't quote me on the exact date on which it came into force. But the ICCPR and ICSCR, which are known as the International Bill of Rights, which were the sort of binding treaty that came out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, didn't come into effect until a decade later, when they were finally had enough ratifications, and wasn't even open for signature until after the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Again, a masterclass in diplomacy in the newly independent states, led by the newly independent states post-decolonization. And so, first of all, the existing international human rights system is not just the authorship of the United States or of the West. It would be a mistake to understand in those terms. These are norms that were hard fought for, contested, remain contested, and the premier forum in which multilateral forum, so forum in which all states have a seat and are present for human rights, is the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Now, that council is one from which the United States has basically withdrawn. The Trump administration explicitly withdrew from the Human Rights Council in its first term, during the first administration. Before that, the Bush administration had done the same thing. But it's the Biden administration that decided not to. The Biden administration resumed a seat at the Human Rights Council, was up for renewal of its seat, and sought not to renew its seat. And the reason for that, of course, is, amongst other things, the support that the United States has shown for Israel's campaign in Gaza and its denunciation globally by the vast majority, 99% of all states in the international system. In vote after vote at the UN General Assembly, the US is isolated together with Israel, a couple of Micronesian states, et cetera, in all of those votes. And that isolation of the United States and the exposure of the massive double standards by which the United States was using the language of human rights to seek to build coalitions in support of Ukraine, while simultaneously trampling on the language of international humanitarian law and human rights in its insistence on continuing to support Israel in the use of the veto power at the Security Council. All of this came at a political price at international institutions that itself demonstrates, A, that they have a reasonable measure of autonomy from the United States and from US coercive foreign policy, and B, that the norms and institutions are actually remarkably enough. I wouldn't necessarily have predicted this if you had asked me in October 2023, but they have actually proven their capacity to hold and to actually apply these norms in the face of the extremity of circumstances in Gaza. So both the case advancing at the International Court of Justice, and I don't just mean the South Africa case, there's also a case that's been brought by Nicaragua against Germany, which is a case that goes after states for their responsibility as a consequence of their complicity in the commission of genocide. So it's not just that there is a plausibility of finding a plausible genocide, but that has implications about the obligations of all signatories to the Genocide Convention to take action to prevent genocide from taking place and to not be complicit in the commission of genocide. And that too is being tested, and accountability amongst Western states is being tested before the highest institutions that have rarely spoken truth to power. The ICC reluctantly, perhaps under its current prosecutor, but ultimately, inescapably, issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Now, of course, that's alongside arrest warrants that were issued for various Hamas leaders as well. But at the end of the day, these institutions are actually applying the norms. And so the idea that human rights has been depreciated, I mean, the United States is seeking to depreciate the language of human rights. It has, of course, depreciated its own ability to wield these tools effectively as part of its foreign policy. And that should not be allowed. So that's actually a constructive moment when great powers can no longer use the language of human rights to advance their projects, their strategic projects, which actually, as a material fact, operationally trample on human rights. The inability to do that is salutary for the system. Now, the Trump administration, in distinction from the Biden administration, is not fond of the language of human rights, is unlikely to use that language in the first place. And again, there's something ultimately to be said for naked pursuit of imperial strategic objectives, because then the stakes are clear. When the Trump administration expresses its ambitions to control the Panama Canal, to seize Greenland, there is again a kind of clarity for counterparts to the Trump administration, counterparts to the United States as to the stakes unfolding in US policy. It's unclear to me the degree to which Trump policies will be materially worse than Biden administration policies, but they will be presented in this fashion that is unadorned by attention to norms and the language of rights. And that just that unadorned quality itself may be an advantage in the ability for other states in the international system and movements and global civil society to organize to resist some of these objectives from the United States. In that sense, it might be an advantage. It's of course possible. I absolutely don't exclude the possibility that the Trump administration may cause enormous damage in the process, may actually exacerbate policies undertaken by the Biden administration. The recent pronouncements about the need to remove the Gazan civilian population to Sinai is just one example amongst many in which we could see a dramatic worsening of US policies. But the fact that they're not being presented in the language of human rights itself means the US is acknowledging that it can no longer truck in norms that purport that it's acting as a benevolent hegemon. It is now nakedly acting as a coercive actor, and it's doing so at a time when it is in decline.
I mean, there's a lot, you've said a lot, and there's a lot to unpack, and it's really interesting. Are you saying just at the end, I mean, are you basically saying that human rights, in a sense, or at least international human rights, has now been liberated from empire? Because it's so naked in its form that the human rights thing, they don't even have to pretend to go along with it anymore to try to, as it did, I think, in the 1990s, during that unipolar moment, where the US was, at a certain level, very much using the language of human rights within this neoliberal form and other forms in order to, in this kind of post Cold War, post civil wars, post kind of state building, peace building, all that kind of processes, bring in this language in order to bring it to open markets and bring in, civil society and kind of do things that would suit their interest to a certain degree, but also create a certain structure, maybe a more liberal form at certain levels. So there was a strategic interest that the United States in particular had, and kind of the Europeans went along with it. The UN and the international kind of instruments and human rights groups kind of went along with it because it's fine. They said, all right, we're all going in the same direction. Now we're in a sense, from what I understand from what you're saying, that we're kind of liberated, or not liberated. Maybe that's very dramatic, but something along those lines. That there no longer has to be sort of human rights groups. You see, it's interesting. You see Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and these other groups who are taking increasingly, it seems to be taking increasingly not hostile, but it's very clear that they're separating themselves when it comes to talking about apartheid and when it comes to talking about genocide. This is a good thing, isn't it? At a certain level.
Right. And so just to be clear, the ideal thing would be to have a powerful actor like the United States actually complying with human rights, right? And actually taking actions that are supportive of human rights. Now, as I said, the United States does not have a trajectory of doing this, certainly not in certainly not in this millennium, let's say, not in this century. And we could go back and forth about what was actually being pursued in the 1990s as well. But that would be the ideal. But if that's not going to be the case, and worse, if the United States is going to pursue policies that are adverse to the human rights of populations globally, and particularly adverse in the Middle East, then of course it is better for the United States to not also instrumentalize the language of human rights to legitimate its conduct. So that, I think, is the thing that we are at this moment under the Trump administration. It's just unlikely that the administration is going to do anything but dispense with even the niceties of seeking to legitimate its conduct in anything but the most crass, nativist, populist terms, which of course have no appeal for individuals beyond the borders of the United States, because the US is simply saying, we will act coercively because we can, and when it suits us to seize territory, we will do so. Now, these are terrible
Sorry
things.
to interrupt. Does it matter? So the two you're describing it very, very eloquent in the sense of these two approaches. One uses human rights to do something; the other one doesn't bother with it. But it's the same. It amounts to the same. So everybody will then say, okay, so what's the point of the law and the UN, etc.? Does it make a difference beyond to the lawyers themselves? Does it make a difference to people in Palestine?
Right. It's hard to, one of the challenges of studying international law, international human rights law, is to do so from the seat of a hegemonic actor or empire, right? Because you mistake the system's inability to constrain one actor for its inability to constrain in general. It's not the case that it's unable to constrain. And in fact, even very powerful, closely held allies of the United States find themselves caught up in a set of institutional and normative conundra that are costly to them. And Israel is case in point of this at the moment. It's not without consequence that it is being tried before the International Court of Justice, that those arrest warrants have been issued. Now, is the consequence that Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting in a prison in The Hague? No, of course not. That's not the way international law works. It's not, frankly, the way law works in any setting. Powerful, wealthy individuals are generally able to negotiate the way in which laws apply to them with a great deal more autonomy than individuals that don't have those kinds of resources at their disposal. But the fact that is that the law can constrain. Now, can the law constrain the United States? Like, let's look at some very obvious examples. The Iraq War was a war of aggression, and the fact that it was blatantly in violation of international law in no way constrained the United States from committing that unlawful war. Having said that, were there consequences for the United States? Yes, there are consequences. There's a big difference between enjoying legitimacy and global coalitions and the funding of allies, et cetera, for your imperial projects, and having to go them alone or trying to find coalitions of the willing that comprise a set of weak, small actors that are riding on coattails in the hope that bandwagoning brings them some kind of crumbs from the table. So when your only allies that are willing to join you on this or that venture are, let's say, the current Hungarian administration, the Israeli administration, et cetera, when the votes leave you totally isolated in international fora, that means that the soft power of the United States is depreciating. And this is at a moment when not only is the United States relatively speaking in decline. It's still the most powerful economy in the world with the largest military in the world, but it's in decline in relative terms, by which I mean other actors are rising relative to the United States, and the United States faces real competitors in the international system. So take, for example, the recent action by the Trump administration with respect to deportation flights to Colombia, right? The Trump administration said, we're going to frog march individuals and humiliate your citizens, put them on military planes, deport them, and you will accept those planes. The Colombian president said, no, we won't, and then was forced to back down. Okay, is that a win for the Trump administration, which has exercised its muscle with no pretense of international law, no pretense of human rights? Well, now there's an emergency meeting of the Organization of American States to confer amongst themselves how to respond to this. And the very first thing one can imagine all of these states doing is deepening their ties with China, deepening their trade relations with China, and immunizing themselves from further coercive threats from the Trump administration, because the threat of tariffs brought Colombia to heel. 5 years from now, Colombia may be much less vulnerable to the threat of tariffs because it has options and it's going to pursue those options. So the cost of the United States not being able to legitimate its coercive strategies using the language of international law and international human rights law is the incentive that it produces amongst its counterparties. First, they're far less persuaded of the bona fides of American action. There's no real reason other than outright naked inducement, bribes, or being paid for them to go along with the United States. And when the United States threatened coercion to force states to go along with its preferred policies, they began to look to diversify their portfolio of relationships, partnerships, allies, trade, et cetera. All of this just hastens what is already underway, which is, as I've already said, a relative decline. And so the consequence for the United States is not that it can't pursue its preferred policies, that it is constrained from resorting to coercion, is that resort to coercion is more and more costly, and the United States has to apply higher and higher quantum of coercion to get its way, and is less and less able to persuade states to go along with it. Now, the U.S. is not the only actor that uses human rights language to pursue either coercive or at least ambivalent policies. The Europeans are very adept at this. Other states use this language as well. So I'm not saying that human rights has been liberated from its hypocritical invocation, its manipulation for strategic ends, et cetera. That would be too much. But for the moment, the ability of the United States to persuade actors in the international system using the rhetoric of human rights, I think, is fundamentally disarmed.
Okay, Asla, so I have a question for you, Asla, based on what you just said. In terms of this entire discussion, it's incredibly illuminating. It's, as Karim said, it's clarifying, it's depressing at one level, but it's also, there are shreds of not to say optimism, but at least an optimistic realism that this naked use of power on the part of the U.S. ultimately is not sustainable. Is what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying correctly. But is this entire analysis it sounds like you're separated completely from actions in the Middle East. And so when like, in other words, resistance and on all these organizations in the Middle East that say, look, forget putting any faith in what Western institutions and international institutions say, because they've proved themselves time and again totally incapable of actually living up to their own professions. And the only thing they understand is resistance. I mean, exactly. So how do you respond to that? And then, because it sounds like it's not just a question of what the US does and what the US doesn't do, it's also what people in the Middle East do as a dialectic in this kind of thing. So how do you, when you analyze this, how do you bring the Middle East and the people in the Middle East, whether in Turkey, Palestine, obviously Lebanon, Syria, etc., Yemen, Iraq, when you bring them into the picture, how does this change this equation that you're talking about?
So there are a number of ways to get at the answer to that. To begin with, the United States has presided over a kind of Pax Americana order in the region that has fundamentally unraveled in a variety of different ways. On the one hand, there's the actual resistance from people on the ground, people seeking to overthrow authoritarian partners of the United States that are the anchor points of that Pax Americana. There's also the long-term desire of the United States to extricate itself from the Middle East, but only on terms that serve its preferred partners. So its vaunted pivot to Asia is systematically undermined by, for one thing, Israeli conduct, right? And so it's constantly drawn back into the defense of that partnership. But also it is, required to come back in to address the threat to, for example, the free flow of oil that emanates from Saudi adventures and UAE adventures in Yemen. And now we have fundamental destabilization in Sudan, again, being driven by partners of the United States, amongst others. So you have the funny circumstance in which you see the RSF being designated as a genocidal actor by the United States at the same time that the United States is deepening its security partnership with the principal backer of the RSF in the UAE. So there's a kind of incoherence. Maybe that's clearest in the Syrian context at the moment, where the overthrow of the Assad regime by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has brought to power an individual that in a previous instance, the United States treated as a terrorist designated actor detained in Abu Ghraib, enabled that person who had joined al-Qaeda in Iraq as part of an earlier instance of resistance against US power to then, once released from Abu Ghraib, return to Syria, build another movement of resistance on the same kind of an ideological project, and eventually over time partner with other US allies in the region, not least of them Turkey, in order to gain the relevant financial and military backing to ultimately succeed in overthrowing the Assad regime. And so now you have the quandary of a war on terror that began as a frontal assault against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, having brought to power an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, with which presumably the United States is about to try to come to terms. So it's a very complex circumstance in the Middle East, the ways in which US exertions of coercion, for starters, are producing unintended collateral consequences across the region, are themselves those coercive actions interpolated by regional proxies of the United States in the form of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and more actors. And ultimately, what the regional ordering in the region is going to be, and the relationship of that regional ordering to people on the ground. So every time we look at a specific instance, whether it's resistance in the name of national liberation in Palestine, resistance in the name of anti-authoritarian mobilization in Syria, resistance in the name of an attempt to regain civilian control in Sudan, in each of these instances, there's a US finger in the equation that is opposed to the goals of the population on the ground. But the population on the ground is also confronted by a set of regional actors that are working hand in glove collusively with the United States. So that's the complexity of the picture in the United States. And none of it is really about, does international law operate or not operate in the context of those partnerships. Now, of course, in any individual instance, violations of international law may be rife. Again, Gaza is perhaps the most extreme expression, but Sudan comes very close. In both cases, we see the use of collective starvation absolutely prohibited. We saw something very similar occurring in Yemen. But who the actors are and the degree of their relationship to populations on the ground is a sort of complex story. So it's hard to answer your question in a simple fashion.
No, no, for sure. I understand that, I appreciate that, because you are, of course, a scholar first and foremost, and you're adequately nuanced, as you should be, and thank you for that. But I guess the question I was really pushing is more like going on what you said about Latin America. So as the U.S. uses extraordinary force, unfiltered force, basically, without any of the verbiage of human rights, just degradation, violence, force, etc. You're saying there will be a pushback eventually, and as we move into this age of dwindling U.S. hegemony. But isn't that? I guess my question was: didn't the Islamists who are resisting Israel and resisting U.S. hegemony in the Middle East, didn't they have the same analysis that this is all about coercion, overwhelming coercion and force? Therefore, there's no point putting our faith in what the U.S. and the international community says. Therefore, there's resistance. And from a devil's advocate standpoint, you could say, well, they tried resistance and they've been, one could say, well, at least some people say, they've been obliterated as a result. So there's no getting out of a U.S. dominated international order in the short term. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think in the short term well, I wouldn't say that analysis is incorrect in the short term, where the analysis says the U.S. will continue to be the most powerful actor in the short term in the international system. I think that's right. But I think we're confusing a set of different kinds of resistance and categories of resistance. So what I was describing in the Colombian context is the U.S. trying to coerce neighbors in the region to accept policies that they otherwise would be opposed to. In the Middle East, the U.S. uses coercion to back the projects of its own regional allies. So, I mean, Saudi Arabia is not going to respond to U.S. coercion by resistance, because Saudi Arabia, the United States is pushing on an open door. They're acting hand in glove together. Israel, same thing, and a whole range of actors, all the ones I named. In many instances, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, depending on the government that's in power in Iraq at any given moment, Turkey, et cetera. These are all partners of the United States that are moving in the same direction with the United States' coercive objectives. And so in the context of the Middle East, the parties that are seeking to resist that coercion are civil society actors on the ground and the small number of states that once identified with something called the axis of resistance, which has been more or less militarily defeated to the extent that we're talking about non-state actors. And for the state actor, specifically Iran, it faces an extraordinarily constrained environment. Now, having said that, it does face a constrained environment. In the short term, it does face an environment in which it is in an international order that is dominated by the United States. But Iran's conduct has been very comparable to what we're seeing in South America, right? That is the same set of incentives. It has built relationships with China and Russia. It has sought to diversify its position. It has sought to be extraordinarily pragmatic. It has not risen to the kinds of provocations and direct exertions of coercion on its territory that it might have, because it's measuring its position in the short term in a system that's dominated by the United States. It is not going to win through coercion. Iran doesn't have a coercive strategy to resist U.S. preferences. That being said, though, Iran is invested in a longer term or medium term set of policies whereby the U.S. ability to coerce it is going to become more and more costly. How is it trying to do that? On the one hand, is trying to pursue its own defensive capacity. And on the other hand, it's trying to build relationships where it becomes a key to a different ordering in the international system. And that's a real possibility. There's a real possibility under something like the Trump administration that we get to 2040 or 2050, and the incentives of other states are to align powerfully under orders that are not dominated by the United States. And then you have not just a multilateral system, multipolar world, but a world in which, instead of the architecture we have today, a supra order in which all states are participating in the international institutions and fora, you have a splintering. And that, of course, is very dangerous. I mean, the ordering principle that was enlightened self-restraint at the end of the Second World War enabled, for better or worse, under circumstances that brought incredible violence to the peripheries of the order that was created, but nonetheless stability at the center. If you lose stability at the center in a world of nuclear arsenals, you're incomparably worse off. But we are, in fact, heading in that direction. And that is a consequence of, in the short term, you may live in a US-dominated international order, but if it continues to be coercive in a way that's adverse to your interests, you have every incentive to try to build an alternative order that the US doesn't dominate.
So on that Asla, on that point, then I mean I agree with you again. I think we all agree with you, and the question is, I mean, the question I have at least is when it comes to thinking again about the Middle East specifically, and then I think we'll end with a broader question. But when it comes to the Middle East and places like Turkey, for example, how does one respond? Because we've all faced these questions. How does one respond to this sort of, on the one hand, there are states that are part of the US and the international and the European dominated international order. Turkey's part of NATO, for example. It's been extraordinarily, at the level of rhetoric at least, very vociferous in its criticism of the genocide in Gaza. And on the other hand, there's policies on the ground that indicate otherwise, unless we're misreading the situation. And of course, there's domestic repression and so on, in all these countries that purport. So how does one balance this idea of seeing what these states are doing at the same, on the margins of saying they're realizing that there's something fundamentally wrong here in a place like Gaza, where everything is just being obliterated before our eyes, and at the same time are still part and parcel of this same order? How seriously should we take those kinds of criticisms? And how does one position oneself as a scholar where you're trying to figure out, okay, I want to do both. I want to do justice both to the people on the ground in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in all these places, and at the same time keep our eyes fixed on what is the ultimate hegemonic actor here that is doing enormous damage to the entire international system.
Well, one of the tragedies of Pax Americana in the Middle East is that it's produced a set of states that are so dependent on the US that it's the most geopolitically penetrated region in the world by far. And it is the region that is going to be the last one that I think can express effective forms of resistance to the American preference of regional ordering there. So Turkey is a great example of a country that, as you say, has loudly proclaimed its denunciations of the violence in Gaza. But if it finds itself on Syrian territory, where it itself is acting as an occupying power, by the way, if it finds itself directly clashing with Israel, it might fall afoul of the Trump administration's preferences. And then Erdogan is going to be in a real conundrum, because until now, he's been able to speak out of both sides of his mouth, providing for domestic and regional audiences these denunciations, while in effect doing nothing meaningful to intervene in a way that would be helpful to the defense of Palestinians, or anything that would really exact a price from the Israelis. There's not, even from a trade perspective, there's been very limited consequence for Israel. And of course, by contrast to the Arab world, at least at the level of diplomatic engagement, there have been some consequences. Many Arab states still have their ambassadors in Israel, remarkably. So, I mean, again, speaking to the tragedy, as I say, of Pax Americana, that the disconnect between the preferences of the populations in the region and their ability to hold states accountable, even minimally, to those preferences is so profound. And the dependence of those states on American largesse and American support is so great that it is one of the parts of the world that will be the last that will show the signs of a meaningful change as a consequence of the relative decline of US power. But still, you see Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries building strong ties to China. Still, you see these states diversifying their portfolios in terms of markets, turning away from the West as their sole or principal consumer of energy, and trying to diversify their economies away actually from fossil fuels. So there's plenty of things that I think we can expect to see change. But in the region, the true domination by the U.S. strategies as a consequence of energy resources in the region is just really profound. So how do we then, as scholars of Middle East, which all of us are on this podcast, and everybody in the Middle East Studies Association is, right? So how do we think about pulling all of these different strands together? And I think one of the things is that there are elements of international institutions, international norms that have empowered civil society in the Middle East, I think disproportionately so relative to civil society elsewhere in the world, because so few resources are available. So the language of human rights has actually been a language that's been very effectively deployed. This was the story of the Arab uprisings, which spoke in the language of dignity, justice, economic rights, vocabularies that were made available in part because they were able to connect to global civil society and global trends, using languages that were made available by the normative scripts of international human rights. That has been one of the most effective organizing mechanisms internal to the states of the region that are trying to say, well, if the United States purports to speak in this normative language, we will resist the state system preferred by the United States by redeploying that language against the regional sponsors of these states and against the states themselves. That has been a strategy that has at least enabled populations to translate their lived experiences and demands into legible transnational scripts, and has built a set of partnerships and ties that have endured, notwithstanding the repression, right? I mean, as with all things, it is far too soon to say what the ultimate outcome of the Arab uprisings and the momentum and dynamics that they have produced, what the ultimate outcomes will be of all of that. But, events in Syria have surprised us over the last few months. Before that, new protest movements in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Sudan, etc. This is all still unfolding. Those are the parties that have been, at least to some degree, empowered by the existence of an international architecture. But it is set against a structure in which the populations of the region are trapped under regional proxies of US power. And so long as the US remains the most powerful actor in the international legal order and the principal backer of these regimes in the region, it will remain an obstacle to the realization of the aspirations of populations. And our role here as scholars in North America is not just to study the societies and understand the circumstances, granular circumstances that express that experience, which is different in Yemen than it is in Egypt, than it is in Libya, than it is in Syria, but also to always remember what our situation is, what our location is. We are engaging in this study, and we have the privilege of knowledge production about the Middle East, in part because we're in the imperial capital. We have access to archives, access to travel funding, access to research, et cetera. The minimum thing we owe is solidarity. The minimum thing we have to give back is not only solidarity with the populations that we're studying, but also solidarity with our own colleagues who don't have any of these luxuries as a consequence of the policies of the country where we pay taxes. Beginning with Gazan scholars, where we began this conversation, whose entire higher education sector has been destroyed, whose colleagues and students have been killed, and expanding all across the region. Every displaced scholar in the region has been displaced in one way or another as a consequence of also policies of the United States, also funding by the United States. People have faced destruction from Libya to Iraq to Yemen to Gaza to Syria as a consequence of the taxes we pay. So in thinking about the Middle East Studies Association and all of us as a scholarly community, I think we have to ask some fundamental questions about what our responsibilities are beyond our own campuses. And again, bringing our conversation back to academic freedom, but thinking about it in global terms.
Well, Asla, thank you for that. That is absolutely a brilliant place to wrap and to end this conversation with these insights, these incredible insights, and this call to an ethical sort of academic take and human take on what has been going on in our part of the world, the part of the world that we study, but also the part of the world where Karim, of course, is located as well. So, Asla, thank you again, and it's been a great honor and pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's great to see all of you.
Okay, guys, that was a really deep and insightful session with Asla. Karim, as the person who's closest to Asla's, expertise in international law and UN and the international world order, what were your thoughts on that discussion?
Well, of course, a lot of this was on the question of US campuses, which I'm sure you'll talk about. But no, I think it's, of course, it ties to the last episode we had with Wadia Saeed, on these larger questions of international law and the international order, and this very stark thing that the Gaza genocide has brought up, which on the one hand, the total destruction of these norms, or the attempt at the destruction of these norms of human rights, of humanitarian laws, of just total lack of use of human rights in all of its forms. And on the other hand, the proliferation of all these cases in international institutions, in these international courts like the ICJ, like the ICC, the General Assembly, all sorts of things, And I like this idea of again, I said liberation, but it's not liberation, but this idea of potential separation of this human rights agenda from this American policy in particular, that will certainly be pursued during this Trump administration and wasn't taken seriously by the Biden administration, although they did try it. As Asla was saying, I mean, they did try to couch some of their stuff in human rights or in humanitarian law, but it was obviously, it just was extremely ineffective. Now Trump, I don't think, will even bother, and that's what she said. So it's interesting to kind of to see, because of course, some of you asked it. I mean, it's always, the questions are always going to come So what is international law? What is the UN? What's the point? It's all useless. People, one can easily descend into those kinds of questions. But I think her response, as Wadia's response, as Richard Falk's response, as all the lawyers and all the international lawyers,
Nimmer's response,
Nimmer as well, all the international lawyers that we've had on, they all ultimately, come back and say, yeah, well, there's a lot of important aspects to it, even if it's not, readily apparent to legal scholars. And that includes, of course, the whole idea of legitimacy. So you can hold on to something, and you can use coercion and force, but if you lack legitimacy, there's something missing in terms of being able to complete and kind of have a much stronger form of power. So this, I think, is important and something we need to bear in mind. What did you guys think?
Yeah, Sadie, what do you think in terms of the doubling down as well? That you started our whole discussion with the U.S. campuses, and then we just in the week that's passed, Sadie, as you know, Ali Abu Na'mi was arrested and deported from Switzerland. I mean, it's like on the one hand, Karim is saying and Asla is saying that there is something important in the disentangling of law from the clutches of U.S. imperialism. On the other hand, there's a doubling down everywhere we see. It's completely unrepentant, the assault on freedom.
Well, the assault on freedom in the Western world is connected to the Zionist state. I mean, ultimately, right? I mean, the repression we're seeing on campus. Yes, it's true, as Asa said. There's been a long-standing right-wing sort of revanchist project to attack diversity programs in universities, or attack what the right considers to be critical race theory, and they have no idea. They seem to have no idea what that actually means, but it's like a bugbear of theirs that with which they've been obsessed for a number of years. They haven't really made inroads into actually clamping down on universities until they arrange this wedding with Zionism, basically, right? So now what we see on our campuses, and not just in the political system at large, is this unholy alliance in the US, I'm speaking now, between right-wing revanchism and Zionism. And so like all of the right-wing dream to repress universities and crush universities, which, as I said in our discussion, goes back to the Trilateral Commission it's like 30, 40 years ago now. It's enabled now because of the power and flex of the Zionist lobby and all of the networks of Zionism, meaning not just like organizations like AIPAC and the various other organs of the Zionist lobby in Washington, but also the network of affiliates to that organized lobby, meaning donors and regents and whatever, as they're dispersed as they are. And they all work in concert now because they have the same agenda. And look, if you want to understand the power of the lobby in America, it's when you see, as Oslo was talking about her experience at Columbia or other places too, when you see universities shut down, universities patrolled by police, universities with gates closed to the outside world. That is Zionism. I mean, that's what that's the incredible thing, right? Or when you see Ali Abu Na'mi being arrested in Switzerland, when you see a normally, at least
arrested Sadie for the crime of actually speaking or trying to
yeah,
speak,
it didn't even have a chance to speak.
Sorry,
I mean,
being invited to
that's what I'm
speak
saying.
about
Like this
Palestine.
incredible assault on freedom of expression and academic freedom and intellectual freedom and press freedom and journalistic freedom. It's all in defense of this unbelievably indefensible state, the Zionist
what
state in
Asla
the
said,
Middle East.
right?
That's yeah.
The phrase she used, the perversity of dissent becoming discrimination, right? Isn't that what she said?
But that's a specific legal tactic being used now in the U.S., where Zionists are claiming to be a minority and stuff like that, and they're trying that. This is a new tactic, like the whole anti-Semitism thing. They've tried that. I don't know. It hasn't run its like Harvard just adopted the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Zionism, which is insane. But there you go.
And NYU.
And NYU and other private places made it. Public places, fortunately, can't do that. And as we know, that definition was struck down by a federal judge in Texas. When Texas tried to do that, University of Houston tried to adopt that definition, and it went to a federal judge, and the judge said no. Obviously it's unconstitutional because it involves the preclusion of free speech. It's a violation of the First Amendment. But private places are run by different standards. Anyway, my point is that this long-standing right-wing dream to suppress universities has come true only with the right-wing marriage to Zionism. And somebody like Elise Stefanik, the U.S.'s new UN ambassador. She's a case in point. She is, virulent right wing. I don't know what her personal views are. I don't think she's necessarily sympathetic to Jewish people, but I don't know.
But what's
But
sorry, just a question.
But here she is an ardent Zionist all of a sudden because it suits her political.
What about the
agenda.
right wing obsession with freedom of speech? Isn't that also part of their?
But that's what I was going to ask. So, but the thing is, in the U.S., right, there is also this other strand that is the libertarian strand, that does privilege free speech, and is opposed to this kind of muzzling of all of our freedoms. So there's a kind of the right wing is breaking up in America. That's sort of also what Trump represents. So but that same right wing strand that insists on our libertarian freedoms, like free speech and so forth, but the right to bear arms, like all those other kinds of things too, go with this strand of the right wing in the U.S. The international version, or its international expression, is isolationism, which is also very strong on the right in the U.S. And the irony
I'm
is,
not sure
in a
how
way,
strong. Sorry, I'm not sure how strong. I think there's a discourse of isolationism, but there's no way is there an actual policy in any way, shape, or form advocated by the vast majority of the Republican or the right in this country. They're all for this $1 trillion budget of a military sort of.
no, yeah, because those
The budget is something
Congress,
else.
yeah, the budget, because the Congress, they're all in hock to their own local lobbies and the money and the arms, the weapons makers.
That's
and all this,
local.
right?
That's because they're produced in
It's okay.
America.
But if you
and
notice how Trump talks, especially his first instantiation, a lot of his talk, it didn't go anywhere in the end. But the talk that he expresses, although I think we have to understand Trump, I don't think he's necessarily right wing. I don't think he has any politics. I think his number one concern, his only ideological concern, is himself. He could just as soon be a communist as a right wing, libertarian. He's his only concern is himself. But the point is, a lot of the stuff that Trump, in trying to latch on, it's like in trying to build up his brand, a lot of the stuff he said was, why are we getting involved in all these wars? Why are we doing this? Why are we investing in why are we part of NATO? Let's pull out of NATO. Like all those kinds of things represent that strand of US isolationism that, of course, there are powers against it too, above all various lobbying organizations, the arms companies, and so on and so forth. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned it, Sally, before, and it's I think quite stark. You've written a lot, Sally. You've written a lot about this, the liberals and the business of denial and the liberals and we can see now how, in a sense, Zionism has exposed liberals and the liberal order at the international level. But now we see, now we see the right wing as well being, even within the Trump administration. I mean, we were all talking about, you have the bunch of kind of America firsters, and then you have the other guys, the neocon types and the kind of total Zionist types. I mean, if you see the Tucker Carlson wing, it's interesting. I mean, they in terms of what they want to do in the United States and the anti-immigrant and all this stuff, they're all kind of on the same wavelength. But internationally, Tucker Carlson is he had people talking about Palestine now, and he has people critiquing the Israelis and saying, well, why, whatever, they can do what they want, but why should we be involved in that? And why should we support? And why should we send our arms? And why should we be involved? So you have a separation, and these now see, and it's true in the social media as well. If you follow the social media, you'll see that there's an increasing split. It's new, but it's increasingly.
It's new. It's been there.
It's been there, but now
and
you have
Ukraine is one of the places.
Ukraine, and then Palestine.
Where it came out.
Ukraine
Yeah,
and Palestine.
I think we're overestimating the influence and the power of this split.
Nobody said that necessarily it's going to go anywhere. I'm just saying it's a tendency that's there. It's
sure.
always been there. I mean, America's always had there have always been isolationist tendencies in the U.S. But they're competing with other interests, which are the Zionist ones and the arms industry and all those kinds of things.
As you know, the isolationist tendency in the U.S. is predicated on the idea of expansion within the U.S. In other words, the expanding of the U.S. borders and obliterating Native Americans and indigenous peoples. So that whole isolationism is a fiction. It's a fiction.
Of course.
In the contemporary form.
I think it's important to understand.
And the contemporary version is the one that says, and I said Trump sometimes he blurts it out in the way that he does. You're right. He blurts out all kinds of things. Who knows what's going on in his head, if there's anything going on in his head? But when he blurts it out, it's why are we getting involved in all these foreign wars?
Well, yesterday,
that moment in one of in one of the talk shows in his first, when he was debating Hillary Clinton. who's like the exact opposite. She represented that the democratic liberal order of let's invade and bomb and take over and bomb Libya and destroy
Incredibly
Iran.
callous, incredibly cruel.
That's
Yeah.
Trump's his I think his initial inclination is, no, why are we doing that? Why are we invading other countries? What's in this? And then above all, like the Tucker Carlson question Kareem asked, what's in this for us? And of course the answer is nothing is in this for us as a country or as people. It's of course arms, the weapons makers make money and stuff like that, but other companies might make more money if the US had a different kind of policy. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting to watch these things because I think Ukraine and now Palestine have brought this out. So you see completely, there's a libertarian right-wing strand in America, like Tucker Carlson, for example, that is now, I'm not going to say they're pro-Palestinian, but they're
not
increasingly skeptical.
Yeah.
No, they're not, but they're increasingly skeptical of Zionism, which is a relatively new thing on the right in the US, so I don't know. I think it's interesting.
We should actually have something on that. We should wrap, guys, and we should have somebody on the show at some point to talk about the right in America, or the right globally as well. But in any case, thank you all, and for all our audience, please, you may want to, if you want to help us out and help us defray the cost of production, subscribe to our Patreon account, and also if you're listening to this on any platform, give us a 5-star review because it helps circulate the show. And thank you again to all of you and to our producer.
Thank you, everyone.